The Calomend was not, by any honest measure, a beautiful ship. She was a Type 4 bulk freighter, hull class discontinued 41 years before I signed on as her quartermaster, and she wore every one of those years on the outside. Patches of 3 different alloy grades ran across her forward section like a quilt someone had stitched in the dark. Running lights were mismatched. 2 green, 1 amber, one that flickered in cold temperatures and which our engineer, Petra, had long since accepted as a permanent feature of the ship rather than a problem to solve. Her cargo ramp squealed when it lowered. Atmospheric seals held fine, but they held fine in the way of a very old argument, by habit and familiarity rather than by any structural grace. I mention all of this so you understand what Veth'kai saw when we came into docking range of their fleet anchorage at Chedras Point. We had been routed there by a routing authority that did not particularly care what we thought of the detour. The Veth'kai Hegemony had issued a transit compliance order requiring all non-hegemony commercial vessels passing through the Chedras corridor to commit to a formal inspection and anchorage log. Our captain, Davharan, read the order twice, set it down and said, "Fine," we complied. We altered course. We docked. The anchorage itself was built around a Veth'kai fleet tender, a ship so clean and symmetrical, it looked less like something that had been constructed and more like something that had been grown in a controlled environment. Polished white composite hull, uniform amber running lights, every one of them steady. Knees that hangar bays that opened and closed with the particular mechanical precision that communicates institutional wealth without ever having to say so. We came in alongside her on docking clamps 4 and 5. I was watching the feed from the external cameras. I saw the moment the hangar crews noticed us. The Veth'kai are avian in the way that matters most when you are trying to read their expressions. Every shift of feeling shows in the crest. The crest rises when they're alert, fans when they're excited, flattens back against the skull when they're contemptuous or bored. The 3 hangar techs who walked out to run the docking lines all had their crests flattened by the time they were 10 meters from the ship. Not alarmed, not hostile, something lazier than that. One of them said something to the other 2. I didn't have audio on the external feed, but I didn't need it. The other 2 looked at each other, and then back at the Calomend, and the crest on the one in the middle rose just enough to indicate he was trying, not to find something funny. He failed. The inspection team arrived 20 minutes later. There were 4 of them, a logistics officer, 2 technical assessors, and a junior aide who was there to take notes, and who spent most of the inspection doing something between taking notes and sketching. I thought briefly that he might be logging findings. Later, when one of our crew caught a glimpse of the tablet, it turned out he had been drawing the ship. Not in a technical way. In the way a naturalist might sketch something unusual they had found on a trail, something alive that they could not quite account for. The logistics officer, whose name was something I couldn't pronounce, and whom I therefore logged internally as the Commodore's man, conducted the inspection with the particular energy of someone doing a job they find very easy and only mildly entertaining. He read the hull registration number and checked it against his records. He noted the mismatched running lights. He noted the alloy patches on the forwards section. His crest moved the whole time in small calibrated flicks. Petra told me, afterward, was the Veth'kai equivalent of clearing your throat between sentences when you find yourself too amused to be professional. He asked to inspect the engine room. Petra took him. When they came back, the Commodore's man's crest was fully fanned, which is the one I mentioned. Excited, or trying not to laugh. Petra's expression was the one she wore when she was being patient. They are not the same expression, he asked her, through the translator. How old the primary drive coupling was, she told him. He asked her to repeat the figure. She did. He turned to one of his assessors and said something that the translator rendered as, "It predates the current measurement standard." The assessor looked at Petra and then at the engine room door and said something back that the translator did not render, which usually means it was too colloquial to parse cleanly, which produced a suppressed crest flutter in the aid with the tablet. The inspection wrapped up in another half hour. They found nothing wrong, because there was nothing wrong. The Calomend was old, and she looked it, but she ran. The Commodore's man filed his anchorage log, left us with a copy of the compliance receipt, and walked back toward the tender's inner gangway. I watched him go on the external feed. He said something to the hangar crew on the way past. The one who had been trying not to laugh earlier let himself laugh now. We're scheduled to depart the following morning at 06 Fro. At 0340 the Anchorage comm channel opened on a priority flag. Not ours. Theirs. I was on watch. I took the call. The voice on the other end belonged to the Veth'kai Fleet Tender's operations officer, and the voice had a quality in it that I had not heard during the inspection. It was asking for something rather than telling us something. The tender had developed a coolant flow failure in her primary thermal exchange loop. Their engineering team had diagnosed the fault, a fractured manifold coupling, stressed. But the tender did not carry a spare in that specification, because ships that new and that expensive were not expected to require that kind of repair at anchorage. Their fabrication unit could produce a replacement, but it would take 11 hours, and they had a fleet recall order requiring departure in 4. Did we carry, by any chance, any legacy manifold couplings in general cargo or ship stores? I went to the inventory the way I always go to the inventory, which is to say I already knew the answer before I pulled up the screen. The Calomen carried 3 legacy manifold couplings, in 3 different pressure ratings in a locker off the secondary cargo bay, because Petra had sourced them from a parts broker 8 months ago. And they had been sitting there ever since, waiting. I told the operations officer we might be able to help. I went and woke Petra. Petra did not say anything for a moment after I explained the situation. She stood in the doorway of her bunk in her work clothes. 'Cause Petra sleeps in her work clothes, and she looked at me with the expression that is not patience, and is not its opposite either. Then she went to get her tools. The repair took 19 minutes. Petra replaced the fractured coupling, pressure tested the line, ran the thermal exchange loop through a full cycle, and handed the Veth'kai chief engineer a handwritten note with the torque settings she had used, and a recommendation about the secondary mounting bracket, which she had noticed was showing early stress marks, and which would, in her professional estimation, cause them the same problem again in about 6 months if they didn't address it. Chief engineer stood there, reading the note. He was one of the avian ones, taller than the others. Crest held very still, in the way that means not flattening but actively held. The held still crest is the one that means you are recalibrating something. He asked Petra, through the translator, how she had known what coupling to bring. She told him the manifold series, the pressure range, the compatibility cross-reference. He asked how she had that information. She said she knew the specs on most drives built before the current classification standard because most of the drives she had worked on were built before the current classification standard. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the Calomen, which was sitting in docking clamps 4 and 5. The same way she always sat anywhere, without apology or ceremony, her amber light flickering the way it always flickered in the cold. He said something to his crew. The translator gave me, file a technical assistance commendation for the civilian vessel. Standard form. We departed at 0600 as scheduled. The tender was already running her thermal exchange loop at full capacity when we cleared the docking clamps, which I noted, and which Petra did not comment on. Because Petra does not comment on things she already expected, Courage kent us off with a courtesy clearance code, which knocked 4 hours off the next corridor checkpoint. That was new. Dov read the commendation when it came through on the formal channel. He set it down. He poured himself a coffee. He said, "That'll do." That was the end of it.